Thank you for having me. And I need to also thank Delta Airlines, who helped me to get into a contrarian spirit for giving this talk today by delivering me to Cleveland well after midnight last night, and without my bags. So I apologize. I did pack a tie to wear, but it is not with me. Okay, so in the late summer of 2010, I arrived on the campus of St. Norbert College in De Pere, Wisconsin. I was a newly minted assistant professor, brimming with optimism, and the field with which I increasingly identified my work, this digital humanities, had just been declared the next big thing by William Pennepacker in his Chronicle of Higher Education column. We are now realizing, he had written of the professors gathered at the Modern Language Association's annual convention, that resistance is futile. So of course, I immediately proposed a new Introduction to Digital Humanities course for upper-level undergraduates at St. Norbert. My syllabus was perhaps hastily constructed, patched together from Intro to DH syllabi in a Zotero group, but surely it would pass muster. They had hired me, after all. Surely they were keen to see digital humanities in their curriculum. In any case, how could the curricular committee reject the next big thing, particularly when resistance was futile? But reject it they did. They wrote back with concerns about the student constituency for the course, its overall theme, my expected learning outcomes, the projected enrollment, the course text, and the balance between theoretical and practical instruction in the day-to-day operations of the class. My initial reaction was umbrage. I was certain that my colleagues' technological reticence was clouding their judgment. But upon further reflection, which came through developing, revising, and re-revising this course from their feedback, and learning from students who have taken each version of the course, I believe they were almost entirely right to reject that first proposal. As a result of these experiences, I've been thinking a lot more about the problem of digital humanities qua digital humanities, particularly amidst the accelerated growth of undergraduate classes that explicitly engage with digital humanities methods. So in the first part of this talk, I want to outline briefly 4 challenges that I see hampering truly innovative digital pedagogy in humanities classrooms. And to do so, I want to draw on my experiences at 2 very different campuses. The first, this small, relatively isolated Catholic liberal arts college, and the second, a medium-sized research university in a big city, as well as experiences of colleagues who I've spoken with in a variety of institutions around the country. So as an opening gambit, I want to suggest that undergraduate students do not care about digital humanities. And I want to suggest further that their disinterest is right and even salutary, because what I really mean is that undergraduates don't care about DH qua DH. In addition, I don't think that most graduate students in literature, history, or other humanities fields come to graduate school primarily invested in becoming digital humanists, though there are, of course, exceptions. Indeed, we're well into a backlash against DH, particularly amongst graduate students who feel that the priorities, required skills, and reward structures of their disciplines have shifted under their feet in ways they cannot account or adjust for. How they got my picture for this meme, I don't know, but there you go. While I would argue, and I will argue today, that the perception of wholesale DH transformation is largely wrong, I would also contend that graduate students' skepticism of the rhetoric around DH is neither misguided nor inconsequential to those of us who believe that DH pedagogy matters to the futures of our fields. Very broadly, then, I will contend that we must work to take both undergraduate disinterest and graduate resistance as instructive for the future of DH in the classroom. So let's begin with rhetoric. Specifically, the rhetoric with which we often frame the digital humanities field. The rejected course that I first proposed at St. Norbert revolved around DH itself, and it began with a bevy of articles grappling with the question, what is digital humanities? What is DH has become a genre in its own right. There are no shortage of such pieces making all sorts of claims about what the field is or should be. If you want a primer for this, the Digital Humanities Department at the University College London has published a book defining digital humanities. And their director, Melissa Terrace, maintains a regularly updated bibliography of this genre. What better way to outline the field we would study in this class, I reasoned, than with such definitional pieces? Except that it's not. What is DH, or worse, who's in or out of DH, are very inside baseball genres, by which I mean it's a kind of meta-academic genre. Digital humanities is often defined in these pieces by a contrast to traditional humanities. DH is collaborative rather than solitary. DH is interdisciplinary. DH is interested in new scales of analysis, and so on and so on and so on. This is because DH practitioners understand, often from hard-won experience, how entrenched fields such as history or literature can be, how suspicious of technically informed methods and tools. Our undergraduates, however, are blissfully unaware of the disciplinary reticences that underlie this term, digital humanities. What is DH pieces can be valuable to folks who are invested in conversations about the humanities, about the future of the academy, and so forth. They help articulate the value of digital scholarship to colleagues unaware or unsure about the work we do. But even here, I think these pieces inevitably fall short. They speak of DH as an identifiable and singular thing, even if that thing contains multitudes, when in fact DH is often local and peculiar, a specific configuration of those multitudes that makes sense at a given institution with its specific faculty, staff, and students, given its specific, unique mission and areas of strength. In one off-cited what is DH piece, and I'm realizing now, can you see this in the back? You have screens there too? Fantastic. I was worried for a second that this was going to fall flat. All right. In one off-cited what is DH piece, Matthew Kirschenbaum calls digital humanities a tactical term that can help practitioners position themselves for institutional authorization of various sorts. So you can see here, he says, on the one hand, digital humanities is a term possessed of enough currency and escape velocity to penetrate layers of administrative strata, to get funds allocated, initiatives underway, and plans set in motion. For Kirschenbaum, the tactical coinage of digital humanities can be unabashedly deployed to get things done. As true as this can be, particularly at the administrative level, DH remains a murky term for our colleagues and our students, and to be honest, it's a murky term for those administrators as well. What's more, the many options offered in these what is DH pieces do little to clarify the question, and in my experience, these definitional articles don't clarify the field to newcomers, except to erect ideas of barriers that are more rigid in prose than in practice. I have never known a colleague read such a piece and come away saying, I am a digital humanist after all. It's never happened. Maybe it's happened to you. I'd love to hear about it if it has. Even more problematically for our students, such pieces just fall flat. Shockingly, the language of disciplinary landscapes and infrastructure and free-floating signifiers does not set the average undergraduate's heart a-twittering. Indeed, to assign such a piece to a class of undergraduates is to forget our audience entirely. Our students are just learning the rules of the humanities game. As Adeline Coe commented on the blog post that started me down this line of thinking, to introduce DH discussions on the level we're used to may alienate undergraduates who are only starting to learn the conventions of the disciplines that a lot of DH debates are critiquing at meta levels. So I've written that using the term digital humanities is often a tactical error, particularly when trying to introduce DH into the undergraduate curriculum. Today I want to take this point one step further and suggest that our concern with defining and propagating the field writ large can interfere with innovative but necessarily local thinking about digital skills, curriculum, and research at both the undergraduate and the graduate level. This fall, I structured even my graduate DH course to avoid the what is DH genre entirely. And I think the course has been better for that decision. Rather than beginning with interminable discussions of what counts or doesn't, or who's in or who's out, we've worked toward an understanding of the field by studying the theories and methods that undergird it, focusing on its projects and critical publications rather than on its attempts at self-definition. This still isn't a perfect model, and we can talk about some of the drawbacks to this model if you'd like. But I found that teaching text maps networks has been a more productive and stimulating class than its immediate predecessor, which was called Doing Digital Humanities. Indeed, you might notice that a course once called Doing Digital Humanities has become in its subtitle, Digital Methods for Literary Study. This isn't because the course is no longer a DH course, or that it's no longer interdisciplinary. In fact, I have more history students in this iteration of the class than I did in the previous one. But I have realized that my teaching and scholarship, while it benefits enormously from interdisciplinarity, is grounded still in my training in textual studies, the history of the book, and critical editing. And I've become increasingly convinced that DH is only going to be a revolutionary interdisciplinary movement if its practitioners bring to it the methods of distinct disciplines and take insights from it back to those disciplines. We shouldn't forget that humanities is not a self-evident signifier. What humanities does and does not comprise differs from definition to definition and from institution to institution. Think of anthropology. Where is anthropology at your school? I bet it's not always in the humanities, right? It's one example. For our students, as for many of us, if we were being honest, the word humanities is opaque, vaguely signifying fields that are not the sciences. To talk about digital humanities, then, is not to talk to our students, but to talk to each other, which is not to disavow that important conversation, but to suggest that it needn't interfere with our teaching. Attempts have been made to revise the terms we use. Bill Panapacker recently proposed digital liberal arts as a replacement for DH, particularly at small liberal arts colleges in which a wider range of fields might be wanted to rally under the banner. And it seems that DLA has gotten some traction at a few institutions. But for undergraduates, I suspect digital liberal arts misses the mark just as badly as digital humanities. I'm not sure that liberal arts signifies much more for students than the humanities. In fact, I remember being at a liberal arts college and having students come to me and say, my parents warned me not to get caught up in all the liberalism here. This is not what liberal arts means. And I actually suspect that digital signifies in ways quite opposite to our intentions. We pair digital with humanities and we feel that we have something revolutionary, but for our undergraduates, the word digital is profoundly unimpressive. Their music is digital, their television is digital, many of their books and school materials are and have always been digital. To brag that our humanities are digital is to proclaim that we have met the base requirement for modern communications. It would be like your bank crowing that you can check your account online. Of course you can. At this point, you would only notice if you couldn't. Far from signaling our cutting-edge research and teaching, I suspect that the phrase digital humanities often raises perfectly valid worries among our students, many of whom have spent their entire educational careers sleepwalking through ed tech nightmares. The point I want to make here is exactly opposite familiar refrains about digital natives. That our students have spent their entire educational lives using digital tools, researching online, using applications to learn math and spelling, listening to PowerPoint lectures and then downloading the slides, or even drawing boxes around Mona Lisa's face on a smartboard. I love this image because they're so happy to be using this smartboard. They're so happy. We can talk about smartboards later. All right. And then these same students came to universities being disrupted by MOOC evangelists. Though these students' very presence in our universities perhaps signals that they realized before many faculty and administrators that self-guided higher education from recorded lectures is perhaps not a new thing to the world. Of course, MOOCs are hardly synonymous with digital humanities, and indeed, DH practitioners have been among the most critical of the MOOC model, which largely transplants a lecture-based model of education online. But our students' perception of educational technology is bound to shade their reading of tech in the humanities classroom. In short, I worry that we dismiss our students' reservations about DH too blithely. Our students' technological skepticism, which is often expressed through the language of, I'm not very good at computer stuff, is not the same as our colleagues' technological skepticism. Many of our students honestly, truly, really choose literature or history or art history or religious studies because they wanted to read and think deeply, rather than follow what they perceive as a more instrumentalist education in business or technical fields. To do so, they often resist substantial pressure from family or friends who are pushing them towards more practical majors. Of course, we know that DH can help students read and think deeply, but we would do well to try and see this exchange from our students' perspective. In many ways, I think we often frame DH in a way that tries a bit too hard to achieve a dead poet's moment. Your other teachers taught you literature with close reading and literary criticism, but in my class, we're going to disrupt that stale paradigm using computers. Now rip up your books and pull out your laptop. These attempts fall flat for all the reasons that I've been outlining above. Indeed, there's a growing body of evidence from students that seems to correlate at least a few of the points I've made here. A 2001 survey by EDUCAUSE, for instance, found that only 1 out of 4 students believes that their institution uses the technology it has effectively. The survey also tells us a good deal about what students, or perhaps more to the point what EDUCAUSE, believes technology entails, namely hardware and mostly commercial software. Few students believe their instructors use technology effectively, and a majority believe that they understand technology better than their teachers do. For such a student, imagine how it must sound to hear her teacher talking up their use of computers and digital tools in the classroom. All right, so there's my diatribe. Don't panic. Because students love doing DH things when those things are framed around particular skills and within disciplinary structures. And I would argue more and more that the way we should integrate DH into the undergraduate curriculum is as a naturalized part of what literary scholars or historians or other humanists do. Teach distant reading alongside close reading, and don't worry about proving how revolutionary the former is. Such an approach also lowers the barrier for doing DH in the classroom. You don't have to be a DH expert to create, or better yet, steal a few really great DH assignments. I want to look really briefly back at that EDUCAUSE graphic again and focus on what students reported wanting to learn more about. You may notice that these skills have little to do with particular hardware or commercial software. Indeed, the skills that students reported wanting to learn are those that would allow them to create their own digital work and perhaps even to create their own tools. In other words, they report wanting to learn how to engage with and not simply use technology in the classroom. So how do we do this in the humanities? So in the last part of my talk, I want to offer a few principles for what I call curricular incursion that have worked well in my own classes and at both the undergraduate and graduate levels. So I'm going to use examples from a few of my courses, but mostly I'm going to draw on a course that I now teach that I revised after that initial criticism, which is not called Introduction to Digital Humanities. It's called Technologies of Text. Where Introduction to DH failed, Technologies of Text has succeeded. And I think after teaching it 4 times, I'm beginning to understand why. My first principle is simply to start small. You do not need an entire DH curriculum or a DH center or even an entire DH course to introduce substantial digital pedagogy into your classes. In departments with a single faculty member interested in digital humanities, and if we were being honest, this describes a significant portion of the humanities departments in the country. Small beginnings can help instructors focus on what DH they can teach effectively. To be frank, I was not prepared to teach all of the DH in my Intro to Digital Humanities class. By contrast, my Technologies of Text class is in essence a book history course with a strong DH undercurrent. Maintaining that kind of disciplinary focus perhaps limits my students' sense of the wider DH field, but it allows me to teach a few things well rather than teaching a lot of things poorly. And indeed, my graduate course has moved in a similar direction. Over the years, my syllabus has shifted from a rapid introduction to as many methods and tools as I can possibly cram into it, to a more focused introduction to a few tools, methods, and theoretical conversations which I know very well. Students don't leave that course knowing the entire DH field, but they leave with a few well-developed skills from which they can build. These courses aptly illustrate the challenges that Rafael Alvarado suggests the larger field faces in defining itself. He claims there is simply no way to describe the digital humanities as anything like a discipline, in large part because of the sheer amount of skills that claim would require of DH scholars and teachers. If coverage is the aim of Introduction to DH courses, only polymaths, as he describes, could effectively teach them. So thinking about starting small, just a few examples from my classes. Starting with things like blogging, engaging critically with the web, actually, which is something that literature students in particular are quite good at. They're good at close reading, and when you ask them to close read this different medium, it begins to help them to think about that medium in interesting ways. This is a student who took Montaigne's essays and translated them into blog form and then sort of commented on what that did to her understanding of the essays, for instance. Again, small, easy use, right? Just jump on the web, do this kind of thing. This is another student who is very interested in the ways that at moments of technological shift, old media inform new media. We had gone to the archive and we had looked at, this is actually an early printed prayer book, but it employs a lot of the conventions of manuscript prayer books, including the font, and actually the pages are ruled, even though there was no monk transcribing who would have needed the ruled pages, right? And so she was very interested in taking these ideas and transferring them to the way the ebooks are borrowing a lot of the conventions from the printed book, right? Again, as a way of thinking about technology in new ways, but again, not requiring a lot of skills to start doing this kind of work. Another thing I've done more and more of in my classes is critical engagements with Wikipedia, right? And this is a chance to make some connections in the library. We have a librarian who is a Wikipedia ambassador at our university, and I've incorporated now every class, at least a week, we do Wikipedia assignments working with the library. Again, very low barrier of entry for students, but it gets them thinking about the ways technology shapes their worldview, the ways that this ubiquitous resource is constructed, who's constructing it, what's there, what's not there, right? Which I think is useful for helping them get started to think about these things. This is one of the pages that was most interesting. This is a social justice group in Boston. My students created a page for it, and a few hours later, the page was marked for deletion, which led to a very interesting discussion of, well, what does it mean to contribute to Wikipedia and to say that anyone can add something to Wikipedia, right? Who's actually editing this thing? So that's a few examples of how to start small, right? Those don't require anything except for an internet connection. So my second principle is going to build on the first. Integrate when possible. Technologies of Text teaches many DH ideas and skills. It's a lab-based course. Every week we have classroom discussions and what I call labs. And in our labs we do technical things like edit Wikipedia, learn the basics of computational text analysis, or program chatbots using the Python programming language. Those labs, however, are framed not within a narrative of recent scholarly revolution, but instead within a sweeping discussion of book and media history. Before students learn to operate a 3D printer then, sorry, I'm going to fly through this, they have, sorry, there's my 3D printer. Before students do this, they have transcribed manuscripts by candlelight in a simulation of the medieval scriptorum, made rag paper to think about the production of material for books, set type and printed on a letterpress, and spent significant time in the rare books room at the Boston Public Library. Each of these labs helps students to understand technology not as something that we invented 10 years ago, give or take, but as a long continuum of human activity. And by contextualizing our moment of digital remediation historically as but the latest phase in a long history of textual reinvention, I can help students understand why my assignments are going to ask them to experiment across modalities. Those assignments then push them beyond their comfort zone. For English students, their comfort zone is writing a 7-page paper. That's not true for all students. asking them to consider the medium as well as the message of their own research and argument. So I'm going to fly through these, but I have a pretty open-ended assignment that lets students engage at lots of different levels. And some students choose to engage in very DH ways, like this student who chose to encode her entire essay in TEI. And the TEI validated, for those of you who know what that is. It was amazing, that moment. But another student was interested in the history of print and playing cards. And so she not only wrote about this and researched it, but she created her own printing plates and printed her own cards as part of the assignment, which was really lovely. I had another student who was a design student. She got very interested in our discussions of typography. And so she made this phenomenal infographic that describes the birth of the Futura font, its cultural milieu, the sort of aesthetic theory behind it, and talks about the current uses of the font as well. Obviously, I should say, obviously this takes some technical skill to, but this is, again, not DH-y in a way. We can talk about that maybe. This student, though, was really interested in books. Is it going to work? Come on. Oh, no. My videos are not working. Alas. Oh, there we go. Okay. This student was very interested in our questions of remediation, books, what it means to talk about a book, what a book does in the world. And so she turned in her assignment as an altered book, right? She took Nicholas Negroponte's Being Digital and cut it up and edited it and embedded her argument into, I think I said on Twitter, and I still believe it, probably the coolest thing that a student has ever handed me. It was one of the smartest, most incredible assignments ever. And again, entirely analog, but deeply DH to my mind, right? And this is just a video of me flipping through it. I need to make a better video of this, but it was an incredible assignment. Another student was really interested in our discussions of encoding, and particularly our discussions of telegraphy and encoding. And so what he created was basically he rewrote Morse code to be a tricolor system, a visual system, to try and simplify it for visual communication. He wrote a lovely essay in which he sort of theorized what he was doing. But as part of that essay, he also built this sort of, it came in a wallet tin, and I was a little concerned when he handed it to me because it looked vaguely threatening. But it was amazing, right? And then he had a code that went with it that sort of explained how he had revised Morse code to make it work faster, was his idea. And then he also, though, in his essay, thought through how that both extended the code, it made it faster, but it limited the code because it was now only visual and not oral at all, right? So anyway, these are the kinds of assignments that I asked students to do. Another student got very interested in text mining, and he used text mining to trace memes through Finnegan's Wake, right, a notoriously difficult text, and actually ended up presenting this work at some conferences and things, right? So I'm trying to illustrate the scale of different kinds of things that students can do in this class when I'm not only asking them to do a few specific kinds of DH things, right? In order to move students toward this kind of engagement, however, we must scaffold everything. From the introduction of new skills into particular classes to the progression of skills through a curriculum. The necessity of scaffolding brings me back to this mistaken notion of the digital native, a notion I would argue that leads to frustration for both students and teachers. The idea is that students must have innate technological skills because they've grown up in a computer-saturated world is equal, to my mind, with assuming that students must be innately gifted writers because they've grown up around books and paper. We know the latter is not true. The very existence of college writing programs belies this idea, but we somehow persist in the former. When the fact is that many of our students need as much guidance thinking about working with technologies of all kinds as they do writing a cogent argument. And indeed, those two tasks can be wonderfully linked, as I hope some of my examples might indicate. And in making this point, I'm not actually trying to sort of castigate students or impugn their abilities. I think that our students now are no more or less technologically adept than generations of students before, right? The big challenge, to my mind, is actually the diversity of skills in the classroom. And this is something I'd like to talk about, because the issue is that if you assume too much, you will leave many students behind. But there are always students who come into the classroom having those abilities, and so finding ways to integrate them without boring them is actually a real challenge that I continue to struggle with in my classes. I've worked to try and make them mentors when we're doing assignments where I know they already have the requisite skills, but it is a challenge of classroom management that is perhaps the real challenge here. Also, those are my twins. So, aw, all right. Certainly, technological imagination is not now, nor has ever been, innate. Yes, our students have grown up with apps and iTunes and YouTube, but it is one thing to be able to use a particular piece of hardware or software, and another thing altogether to imagine what it might do or what it might mean if pushed beyond its typical use. Or even more again, to imagine what might be created in its stead. It's these latter skills that I think good digital humanities pedagogy must inculcate. Not how to use X tool, though that's likely a part of it, but more, let's understand how X functions, delineate its affordances and limitations, and then imagine Y or Z. So how am I doing on time here? Yeah, we're running low on time, so I'm going to fly through this. But this is a different course. This is not Technologies of Text. This is a course I taught called Mapping Boston. And the whole course was focused on thinking about Boston spatially, textually. We read lots of Boston writers. We took field trips all around the city. We went to lots of archives. And what students built in this class were these kind of deep maps where they took a particular neighborhood or landmark in the city, and they layered historical materials, photographs, argumentative text, etc., to sort of bring people through this geospatial argument. We use Neatline for this, if you're familiar with Neatline. And here is where I really think students got into this building phase, right, where they were making something new to the world, and something that they were very excited about. So the last thing that I want to talk about, the last thing that I want to talk about is this, to think institutionally. In order to scaffold things, particularly across classes, we must have a clear sense of where DH skills and courses fit at our institutions. We must think institutionally and create versions of DH that make sense not at some ideal universal level, but at specific schools, in specific curricula, and with specific institutional partners. One major objection to my proposed Introduction to Digital Humanities course is that I wanted to offer it at the junior or senior level. Introductory courses, the committee noted, are offered at the 100 level. Courses at the 300 and 400 level should build on introductory courses. And at first I was really perturbed by this. I saw it as sort of semantic squabbling. But as a new professor, I had little sense of how such committees operate and how they work to structure students' experiences through their time at the institution. Since then, I've worked on such committees, and I've largely come to understand their perspective. I was, in that class, tacitly assuming that my course would build on skills that students picked up in their lower division courses. I expected my students to be competent researchers, independent workers, pretty decent writers. I planned to build on their work in lower division literature and history courses, and I was in essence proposing a digital capstone to the traditional humanities skills they'd picked up elsewhere in the curriculum. My colleagues were right to worry that calling it an intro course would confuse students and advisors about the aims and the activities of the course. That's a very specific example, but there are broader implications. Thinking institutionally can help you connect DH classes and project to local collections, colleagues, to your institution's mission, all things more likely to generate student enthusiasm and buy-in, and perhaps even cooperation from colleagues and administrators. Perhaps the strongest reason to think institutionally is that you can link your courses to libraries, museums, research centers, or other campus-level initiatives. Students love to build projects that make use of their institution's collections and contribute to the institution's legacy. And these often public projects can energize them to work that much harder as they create materials with a chance of life beyond the classroom itself. As a bonus, such projects give faculty the chance to work closely with librarians and other colleagues that we might otherwise see for only short information sessions. So this was particularly true at St. Norbert. We didn't have a lot of collections at St. Norbert. What we did have were really strong collections in artifacts of the Norbertine order that had founded our institution. We had amazing medieval books from the medieval period through the modern period that had either been created or owned by Norbertine monks. And so in my classes, my students worked with these materials. We worked with our library, we worked with our special collection. In this case, there were this amazing collection of translations of St. Augustine's Confessions. And one student was very interested in translation, and she was interested in Augustine, so she created this archive around that project. We had these beautiful missals in our collection. And so another pair of students, a computer scientist and a historian, got very interested in particularly the illustrations in these missals, and they created a wonderful project where they digitized a lot of these materials for the first time. The library was very willing to work with them to do this. And this digital edition then actually sort of circulated among the monks in the Norbertine order, which they were very excited about. Another student was a biology student, and she was very interested. There had been a biologist who had taught at the college. He was also a Norbertine monk, but he had done really important work during the 1950s and 60s, and we had all of his materials, including his pressed plant specimens. And so she did a ton of research digitizing his pressed plant specimens, getting them online, creating exhibits about this man, his work, his legacy. And again, this was the kind of thing that circulated in a much broader community. At Northeastern, I've been working to do a lot of this with my graduate classes. So the first time I taught my graduate course, we needed a project to work on. And Alex Gill at Columbia University was just starting to think about this project around DH in 80 days, which was going to focus on different DH projects around the world. And we basically contracted with Alex to begin the project. My students worked on the first few days of this project, and it was well after the class ended, but a year and a half later, the project actually went online. They're credited here, so it's a kind of publication for them. And they actually sort of did work that had this broader life and effectiveness in the community, which many of them have been very excited about. And then, of course, I helped to get off the ground our marathon project at Northeastern, which I'm talking about this in a teaching talk. This was not part of a class, but I consider this part of my teaching, because my role on this project was I knew something about digital archives. I don't know much about contemporary materials. I'm not an oral historian. And we were trying to gather materials and oral histories and all kinds of things following the Boston Marathon bombings. And basically my role was to shepherd a group of graduate students who then took the project and made it everything that it is today. Why is this about thinking institutionally? Well, we did this at Northeastern partly because we had the capacity, partly because we're a few blocks from the finish line of the Boston Marathon, and partly because, and we can talk about this more, we're a kind of local institution that a lot of people in the Boston area trust. Our archives, they're not extensive, but what they do collect are materials from underrepresented communities in Boston and immigrant communities in Boston. And our specialty is Boston, right? And so we had many people who we worked with on this project who said, I would not have given this to any institution except Northeastern. I would not have given this to Harvard, a few people said. Now, I don't want to impugn Harvard, but they didn't feel the same kind of connection with Harvard that they felt locally with Northeastern. So this was very much an institutional project and very much about teaching the graduate students who did amazing work on this project. All right. So all of this brings me back, as always, to the term digital humanities itself. I have written that digital humanities will only remain a vital interdisciplinary movement if it speaks self-consciously back to the fields to which its practitioners also belong. And in the book, Digital_Humanities, the authors argue that humanities disciplines need to each establish agendas for computational practice, not as a way to assimilate per se, but instead as a way to generate vital, critical, and experimental questions that will keep the field moving forward. But if digital humanities is not a meaningful term in the undergraduate classroom, and graduate students and faculty are charged with developing discipline-specific computational approaches, then why use the term at all? Perhaps one day digital humanities will fall away, as some have predicted. If it falls away because DH methodologies have become widely accepted as possible ways among many to study literature, history, and other humanities subjects, this seems to me a fine outcome. But this is not the DH situation right now. Despite the attention the field has received over the past few years, it remains a very small cohort. There has certainly been an uptick in DH hiring over the past few years. I've benefited, some in this room have benefited from this. But as a result, we often forget that the vast majority of humanities departments include no digital humanities scholars, or at least people who would self-identify as such. We forget also that junior faculty hired to do DH for their institutions often face a steep challenge actually doing that work and making it legible to their colleagues at tenure time. Many colleges who are eager to get a DH person, and as a subtext often to begin getting grant money, have not well considered the infrastructure required to do DH, and as a corollary to do DH in a way that will attract that grant money. Certainly the vast majority of schools, including those that are actively working to build DH programs, have not yet actively reshaped their tenure and promotion guidelines to reward the kinds of knowledge that DH projects often produce. And in that environment, I think digital humanities remains a useful banner for gathering a community of scholars that are doing weird humanities work with computers. And I suspect it will be useful for a while yet, long after the current wave of DH mania subsides, I hope, into a more productive rapprochement with the larger humanities fields. Thanks.
We have time for a few questions if any of you want to step up to the mic.
Thanks, Ryan. You were talking about collaborations that you have with libraries, students going in, doing lots of work. It looked like some Omeka exhibits there. And just wondering, kind of a workflow question, I guess, are the things that students are working with in archives, I guess they're in the university archives, the stuff that is getting digitized, is that going in archives? Is it also going, is it going in two places, I guess, is sort of the question there?
Yeah, the answer to that is sometimes, and it really depends on the project. I mean, so one of the things about structuring the projects the way I have the past few years, and it's something I'm still kind of working through, is an openness to some students doing projects that are just class projects, and some students doing projects that might have a larger life. Because frankly, I mean, some students don't want to embark on a 3-year project in my classroom, and that's got to be okay. Whereas some students really do see it as an opportunity, particularly graduate students, to start a project that's going to be something bigger. And so thus far, we've been taking this on a kind of case-by-case basis. So in those cases where the students are working on something bigger, then we try very early to start conversations with the library about what eventually might be the home for those projects. And we are also fortunate, I mean, with Julia Flanders at Northeastern now, one of her charges in the library is to begin to, not begin, but to really work on building an infrastructure that will support that kind of back and forth more easily than it happens now. But I will say, like, I think part of it is also, I was being sort of utopic with some of these projects, but part of it is also being okay with students who just want to turn in a class project and be done. Because, you know, not everyone who comes to my classroom sees this as part, like an essential part of their career. They're doing it because they're interested and they want to learn a little bit about it, but it's going to end at the end of the class, right?
My name's Eric Morgan. I work at University of Notre Dame. About 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, the library profession did a heck of a lot of navel-gazing. Oh, what's this internet? What should we be doing? How should we be doing differently? And this DH discussion is very similar to that. And you outline many things that you call and other people call digital humanities stuff. And what I saw was essentially taking analog things and marking them up in blogs and wikis and Omeka stuff and creating descriptions of the stuff and then saying that I'm doing maybe deep reading. But then at the end, you outlined some book, and the book said that digital humanities was a lot about computational practice. And I think that there's a spectrum between in digital humanities with digitizing something and going all the way and really exploiting and using a computer. On one hand, we're just automating a process. Yawn. On the other hand, let's see what I can do, really use the computer's capabilities. It adds really well. It can communicate really well. It remembers really well. It can do this with vast amounts of information that a human can't do. This is exploiting the computer. And I think that that alludes to their computational practice. And I'm asking you, what sorts of things can the Academy do to push or make more people aware of the true computational practice that computers can do and move or spread out more this spectrum of what digital humanities is?
Sure.
What can we do computational practice-wise?
Yeah, so one issue with giving a talk is that computational work doesn't actually make pretty graphics often. So I mean, I have students who do text mining projects and things like that. They don't necessarily translate into as compelling a slide as some of the archival projects that they do. So I'm going to say two things here. The first is that I actually think it is to our detriment to too much denigrate the archival work, which is to say, I think some of the most, well, in order to do that computational work, you need materials to compute, right? And actually, one of the things, I mean, this is getting to a really meta discussion, but I think the decrease in funding for simple digitization projects is a real problem in the field right now. It once was possible to get really big grants to do digitization. That's getting harder because it's not seen as sexy enough, basically. And I actually think that this is, I don't know, I think this is a huge problem for the field because one of the greatest contributions that I see is making cultural heritage materials available, making a wider variety of materials available. You know, right now the only archives going are archives that are digitizing things that were already pretty well represented in the print record. So, I mean, that's one thing. Like, I actually love when students do archival projects and actually learn how to think about something like metadata, which is not something that literature or history students ever actually encounter otherwise. At the same time, yeah, that we need to do a lot more work. And so in my technologies of text classes, I mentioned, you know, some of what we do is we learn some basic Python programming. What I wish is that my students had a kind of computing for poets class. Mark LeBlanc at Wheaton College teaches a class called Computing for Poets, I think is what it's called. And it's specifically for humanities students who want to do this kind of text mining and data analysis kind of work, and it's really fantastic. The issue that we've had is that even though we have computer scientists who are part of our Digital Humanities Center, they have a very difficult time getting permission to teach such a course because it takes them away from their, the bigger courses in computer science that they want them to be teaching.
Actually, I think that's part of the issue, that a common theme here is collaboration and interdisciplinary and stuff like this. And you need to have the skills of both the humanist who looks at values and history and ideas, as well as the engineer and computer scientist who's interested in making a tool that does, and they're not really looking for truth. And you've got to figure out a way to match these two groups together. It's like the two cultures all over again.
Yeah, I mean, I think humanists are particularly bad at talking to computer scientists.
And vice versa.
Yeah, I mean, I'm, you know, my research project, which is not what I'm here to talk about, but I'm collaborating with a computer scientist on that project. And, you know, we often think that what computer scientists do is build applications and maybe build websites, and this is not at all what they do, right? And I don't know, I'd push back a little bit. I mean, my sense of computer scientists, at least the ones that I work with, is that they're very interested in the theoretical questions far more than the tool that they will build. That's what they do, that's what they give their graduate students to do, is my experience, is to actually build the tool. But yeah.
Any other questions? Thanks, Ryan.